Good morning. I want to call the Subcommittee on International Organizations, Human Rights, and Oversight to order this morning and kick off our hearing this morning on achieving the UN Millennium Development Goals, progress through partnerships. And I'll begin with an opening. We've got to turn it over to others here for opening remarks and look forward to introducing our panel. 10 years have passed since 192 nations and multilateral organizations set 8 international development targets, which became known as the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, representing a collective international effort toward improving the lives of those living in developing countries. The goals include the eradication of extreme poverty and hunger, achievement of universal primary education, promotion of gender equality and empowerment of women, reduction of child mortality, improvement of maternal health, halting and reversing the spread of HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, environmental sustainability, and creation of a global partnership for development. At last year's UN General Assembly, President Obama stated, "We will support the Millennium Development Goals and approach next year's summit with the goal to make them a reality." It is in the interest of the U.S. to stick to this commitment. We must use this strategy to take a leadership role at the United Nations high-level review of the Millennium Development Goals, which takes place on September 20th through 22nd in New York City. I look forward to receiving the administration's MDG strategy in the coming days. As we recover from an economic recession, it is important to keep in mind that the MDG goals are not only a moral commitment of U.S. and universal values, but they are also vital to our security and economic prosperity. Fighting poverty, hunger, lack of access to education and health care helps reduce unrest and extremism, which can contribute to hatred and violence. The MDGs also help to leverage U.S. aid, bringing in contributions from other countries, the private sector, and civil society. Collectively, our investment helps to reduce extreme poverty and build a growing middle class abroad, which will ultimately buy U.S. products. Achieving MDGs helps the world's most needy, but it also is good for America's producers and consumers. Since 2000, the global community moved steadily toward achieving many of these goals. In developing regions, net enrollment in primary education increased by 5% between 2000 and 2007. Globally, the new HIV infection rate decreased from an estimated peak of 3.5 million in 1996 down to 2.7 million in 2008. And as we heard last month at this subcommittee's hearing on women as agents of change, the women's share of national parliamentary seats has increased from 6% to 19% in the last 10 years. Unfortunately, progress has stagnated in other areas. The mortality rate for children under 5 is still well under the target of a 2/3 reduction, and we have seen an increase in poverty rates over the last year. Finally, as we heard last week at our hearing on the administration's Feed the Future initiative, the number of hungry people increased from 842 million in the early 90s to over 1 billion people in 2009. In order to address these critical challenges, we must adhere to a strategy that is cost-effective, invests wisely in the developing world, and works with our national security strategy. The U.S. government has played and will continue to play a vital role in this effort. However, we need to ensure that we do so in a collaborative manner that leverages all available resources. The private sector is in a unique position to contribute their expertise, resources, and innovative techniques toward this global effort. Targeted public-private intervention programs have already proven successful. For example, the incidence of polio has plummeted by more than 99% since 1988, when Rotary International partnered with the WHO, CDC, and UNICEF to launch the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. Another project, Millennium Villages, supports social and business development services for more than 400,000 people in rural communities across 10 countries in Africa. Finally, there are many microfinance programs that serve as examples of successful public-private initiatives which have helped to reduce poverty and empower women. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about lessons learned from their public-private partnerships and what initiatives can be scaled up to meet MDGs. I will now recognize our ranking member, Representative Rohrabacher of California, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm here to listen to what you got to say. You got a skeptic here, obviously. You know, when you got $1.5 trillion more going out than you got coming in, pretty soon, if we don't change that, you know, last year was $1.5 trillion deficit. This year it's $1.5 trillion deficit. That's not billion-dollar deficit, those are trillions. Within a short period of time, our country is going to turn around and our economy will have totally collapsed. All these young people you see in the audience, it's going to be a disaster for their lives. You know, already they're going to be on the hook for hundreds of billions of dollars that they're going to be taxed from them every year in order just to provide the interest on what we're doing in the last 2 years. So, yeah, we need to care about people around the world who are in need. We got to put our own house in order. And if trying to take care of people across the ocean or in different places where people are in need and in horrible situations, if by trying to take care of them, we exacerbate our problem at home and dump our own future generations into poverty, we will have sinned against our own people. So I want to know why this is a good idea. If you want us to spend more money on it, I want to know why it's a good idea for those young people and their future, and how it will affect this $1.5 trillion worth of debt that we're putting ourselves into every year. Makes no sense. We learned from some papers that were leaked, and I thought the person who leaked those papers did a good job for the people of the world. We learned that Pakistan has continued all these years in supporting the Taliban. Well, we give, Mr. Chairman, a $7 billion package to Pakistan to help them build their economy at a time when we just find out through these leaked documents that Pakistan has been helping the Taliban the whole time. Does that make any sense? That makes no sense at all. Borrowing money from China in order to give to Pakistan, China's ally, in order to help the Taliban while the Taliban are fighting the United States? Well, this is about as much sense that a lot of these programs that I've been looking at over these years make, you know, when you look back on it, makes no sense at all, most of these things. So now that we're in a crisis, maybe we can ask some very fundamental questions. So I'm looking forward to your testimony. I'm going to listen. So we'll see what happens.
Thank you. And now I want to yield 5 minutes for an opening statement to Mr. Smith from New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for convening this very important hearing on the Millennium Development Goals. As you know, the outcome document for the high-level summit on the Millennium Development Goals continues to be negotiated at the UN this week. It will be an important roadmap for the next steps to be taken. I wanted to take this opportunity to focus our conversation and efforts on achieving MDGs 4 and 5 jointly. We must keep in mind that to achieve MDGs 4 and 5, reducing child mortality and maternal mortality, both mother and unborn child must be treated as co-patients in need of care, compassion, and when sick, either patient or both patients in need of timely interventions. We must strive to save and to affirm both. The April 2010 Lancet Medical Journal published a groundbreaking study funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that shows a worldwide maternal mortality has been decreasing since 1980. Progress is being made by many countries, and the successful policies must continue. The study analyzed volumes of studies and data, including WHO maternal mortality data, and using statistical methods now available through advanced computer technology, the study found that the number of maternal deaths per year as of 2008 is 342,900. That's down from 526,300 in 1980, about a 40% drop. The study notes that if the world wasn't suffering from the HIV/AIDS pandemic, the total number would be 281,500, almost 50% down from the 1980 levels. While still too high, this landmark report is encouraging the governments who have been seriously addressing maternal mortality in their countries by increasing the number of skilled birth attendants. I would note parenthetically that I hosted a group of OBGYNs who talked about their work in Africa, and they said, 100 years ago, we realized how to reduce maternal mortality. You need a skilled birth attendant with the capability to do a C-section when there's an obstructed delivery, and you need to have the ability to provide safe blood so that that woman can get a transfusion if necessary. So education of women is also important. I actually chaired a hearing on safe blood, Mr. Chairman, and the WHO rep at that particular hearing said if women in Africa had access to safe blood, maternal mortality would drop by 44%. Unfortunately, for so many, that blood is simply not there. And of course, economic development and the education of women is also very important as well, and there are others. Many of these countries with very low maternal mortality rates have laws, however, that restrict abortion. The inclusion of legalized abortion, or so-called reproductive health services defined as abortion in the outcome document, I believe would be unjust, intellectually dishonest, and counterproductive to the littlest humans and efforts to provide successful efforts for the MDGs. In fact, and this is largely underknown and under-focused upon, abortion can have a negative effect on the reproductive health of the mother as well as the health of her subsequent children. At least 113 studies show a significant association between abortion and subsequent premature and low birth weight births. For example, a study in the International Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology showed a 36% increased risk for a preterm birth after one abortion and a staggering 93% increased risk after two. Similarly, the risk of subsequent children being born with low birth weight increases by 35% after one and 72% after two or more abortions. Another study showed the risk increases 9 times after a woman has had 3 abortions. What does this mean for her children? Preterm birth is the leading cause of infant mortality in the United States and causes 1/4 of infant mortality in the world. Preterm infants have a greater risk of suffering from chronic lung disease, sensory deficits, cerebral palsy, cognitive impairments, and behavioral problems. Low birth weight is similarly associated with neonatal mortality and morbidity. Abortion hurts both mother and child and can cause sickness, even death, in future children. I would also point out to my colleagues that abortion is child mortality for the child who is actually aborted. And again, the mortality, morbidity for future children is at risk. Abortion methods chemically poison, dismember, induce premature labor, or starve to death the fragile life of an unborn child. So terms like safe abortion, which is thrown around very loosely, is at best misleading. Safe abortion is never safe for the baby. Another cause of infant mortality should be addressed in the outcome document, and it's birth asphyxia, which kills 1 million newborns each year, more than malaria and 5 times more than AIDS. There is much we can do, even in resource-limited situations, to ensure that babies take their first breath in that golden minute right after birth. Skilled attendants, again, at birth, temperature support, stimulation to breathe, and assisted ventilation through the use of low-cost resuscitators are interventions we can and should be making available to achieve MDG 4. The MGD document will be very important for guiding our steps as an international community over the next 5 years. Every step counts, and I hope that our panelists will use all of their influence to ensure that the outcome document keeps us on the path of saving both mother and child. Again, I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And now I want to turn to our panel. And let me start to my left with Ms. Kathy Calvin. She is the Chief Executive Officer at the United Nations Foundation. The foundation was created in 1998 with Ted Turner's $1 billion gift to support UN activities. Prior to joining the UN Foundation, Ms. Calvin served as president of AOL Time Warner Foundation. She's also worked at Hill & Knowlton as well as U.S. News and World Report. From 1976 to 84, she served as Senator Gary Hart's press secretary in his Senate office, and on his 1984 presidential campaign, she was a graduate of Purdue University. Next, Dr. John McArthur. He is Chief Executive Officer of Millennium Promise, a nonprofit organization committed to supporting the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. He's also research associate at the Earth Institute at Columbia University and teaches at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. Previously, he served as Deputy Director and Manager of the UN Millennium Project. He has completed his Bachelor of Arts at the University of British Columbia, Master's in Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and a Master's and Doctorate in Economics at Oxford University, which he attended as a Rhodes Scholar. Next, Dr. Scott Ratzan. He serves as Vice President for Global Health, Government Affairs, and Policy at Johnson & Johnson. He is co-chair of the UN Secretary General's Joint Action Plan on Women and Children's Health Innovation Working Group. Previously, he served as Senior Technical Advisor in the Bureau of Global Health at the USAID, where he developed the Global Health Communication Strategy for U.S.-funded efforts in 65 countries. He received his MD from the University of Southern California, MPA from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and MA from Emerson College. And finally, Mr. James Roberts. He is the Research Fellow in Economic Freedom and Growth at the Heritage Foundation Center for International Trade and Economics. His primary responsibility is to produce the Index of Economic Freedom, an annual analysis of the economic climate of countries throughout the world. Before joining Heritage, Mr. Roberts worked for the U.S. State Department for 25 years, serving in Mexico, Portugal, France, Panama, and Haiti. He also served as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve. He has a master's degree in international development and economics from Yale, an MBA from the University of Pittsburgh, and a bachelor's degree in international affairs from Lafayette College. Welcome to our panel. We look forward to hearing from you, and we will start, and I will recognize Ms. Calvin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. And thank you for calling today's hearing on the Millennium Development Goals. Your leadership and support of American efforts to battle extreme poverty, hunger, and disease in the developing world and to support the UN and its programs is greatly appreciated. And thank you for inviting the UN Foundation to testify. When Ted Turner created the UN Foundation, it was because he believed in the UN and its value to creating a platform to connect people, ideas, and resources to support its work around the world and to strengthen the relationship between the United States and the UN. As you mentioned, the President will be bringing to the world leaders in just 2 months his plan for the United States to help achieve the MDGs, as he promised last year when he was before the world leaders. We believe this speech is vitally important because it will signal to the world that our nation will continue to play a leadership role in battling global poverty, despite, as you pointed out, the very tough economic times here at home, and that the United States is fully committed to working with the UN, other donor countries, and the developing world itself. As you pointed out, the MDGs are an internationally recognized framework to allow bilateral and multilateral donors to work together. But it takes more than one sector, and that's why we're here today to talk about partnerships. You might expect me to make the point that the MDGs are a critical component of our strategic imperative, but I want to quote someone else, and that is Secretary Gates, who said last year, in the campaign against terrorist networks and other extremists, we know that direct military force will continue to have a role, but over the long term, it should be subordinate to measures to promote participation in government, economic programs to spur development, and efforts to address the grievances that often lie at the heart of insurgencies and among the discontented from which the terrorists recruit. That is exactly what the Millennium Development Goals seek to achieve. And I think you know, Mr. Chairman, there is strong support for American voters for the MDGs. In April, the UN Foundation and our sister organization, the Better World Campaign, conducted bipartisan polling and found that 87% of Americans believe the U.S. should achieve the MDGs, and a majority said they would favorably look on companies that are using their finances and other resources to support these programs. That's good news for all of us. So I want to touch today just very briefly on the kinds of partnerships that we think work not only to achieve these goals, but actually to multiply the impact and effect of our scarce public funds. I'll start with a couple campaigns you know about. The first is Nothing But Nets, which is a campaign to combat malaria. And thank you for all the work this committee has done to strengthen and increase the U.S.'s support for fighting malaria. As you know, every 30 seconds a child in Africa dies from malaria infection, making it the leading killer of children on the continent. We believed American citizens wanted to join this fight against malaria, so we launched a grassroots campaign 3 years ago called Nothing But Nets to raise awareness and funding. It has a simple message: malaria kills, send a net, save a life, a simple $10 donation. The campaign has been incredibly successful in giving hundreds of thousands of supporters the chance to raise funds and awareness, but it wouldn't be possible without partners from the corporate and foundation world, including diverse partners such as the National Basketball Association, Major League Soccer, and the United Methodist Church. So a pairing of bishops and basketball players might not seem natural, but along with 14 other partners, it's allowed us to raise more than $33 million to distribute more than 3 million nets in 15 countries. We've also done work in combating measles around the world, and this is an example of a partnership that draws on the best of different partners, from the countries themselves to governments to private sector. We found that the challenge for measles was great. Nothing was moving in terms of its reduction, but in the last 10 years, measles deaths have dropped 10% a year in Africa. One organization on its own could never have done this, but it took a partnership. The partnership includes the American Red Cross, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, UNICEF, and the World Health Organization, and the LDS Church, and Vodafone. We've done work in measles, malaria, and polio, and as you mentioned, Rotary International has led perhaps the most successful partnership of all in almost eradicating that. We think there's opportunities across the board for partners to come together. We're currently developing a campaign around adolescent girls to link girls in this country with girls around the world so that they can help those girls share the fortunes that they share here, the same opportunities to go to school, stay healthy, and be safe. We're also working on a partnership to bring organizations together who care about the same issue, freeing up women and children from the dangers of black carbon and cook stove smoke when they are cooking. This is a major effort and has brought together many, many different partners. And we have a major partnership around mobile phones, using them to increase the ability for health workers, as you pointed out, Congressman Smith, to reach those mothers and children who most need it. We've created partnerships with the World Health Organization in 22 African countries so that they could use mobile phones instead of the previous pen and paper to collect data, share information, and help. All of those experiments in partnerships have led us to know a couple different things about partnerships that we think would be worth sharing with this committee as we think about making partnerships successful and an important part of the U.S. commitment to meeting the MDGs. First, in any partnership, it's important to bring all the partners and recipients together at the table from the start. Co-creation is essential. Second, partnerships succeed best when everyone has a clear role to play and can play from their strengths and competencies and not just financial resources. Third, we think partnerships work best when they take the time to create full business plans with clear goals and objectives, serving the various interests of the diverse partners. Fourth, the UN, which traditionally had not been a partner-friendly organization outside its normal member state environment, is becoming much more adept and successful at partnerships, and so is the U.S. government. And so too are the governments in the countries in which we are trying to make a difference. They are our essential partners at the end of the day. And fifth, Congress has an important opportunity to support public-private partnerships in support of the Millennium Development Goals. So as this committee considers legislation to rewrite the Foreign Assistance Act, I hope you'll consider the importance of sending a signal to USAID and the State Department to work closely and use public-private partnerships and to actively encourage these efforts, which they're already considering. Given scarce public and private resources, it's imperative that money be well spent and effectively coordinated. So in conclusion, I just want to say I'm really proud that the Foundation has had a successful history of partnerships, and looking forward, we continue to look for opportunities to expand them and scale them up because we think that's the most effective way we can help achieve the Millennium Development Goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, I want to recognize Dr. John McArthur for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to members of the committee for the honor of inviting me to testify today and for your leadership in convening this important hearing on the Millennium Development Goals that is at what is very much an important juncture in their history. The goals were established by world leaders, as you mentioned, at the Millennium Summit in September 2000. I think one of their greatest contributions is that they are a series of specific, quantified, and time-bound targets to address the integrated challenges of hunger, education, health, infrastructure, environmental management, and gender equality. What they've done is they've galvanized a global effort of unprecedented, if still imperfect, coherence to tackling the challenges that are faced by the 1/5 of humanity that still lives under the most extreme forms and conditions of poverty, which we generally describe as living on less than $1 a day. The summit this September, which has previously been referred to, is the last major checkpoint on the status of the Millennium Goals before the 2015 deadline. World leaders will convene to agree on the actions required to achieve the goals, and the ambitions very much were set by President Obama last September when he asserted in his speech at the General Assembly that the United States will support these goals, will approach this year's summit with a global plan to make them a reality, and will very much set our sights, as he said, on the eradication of extreme poverty in our time. The MDGs are the world's goals. Their emphasis on outcomes has prompted a global effort to address issues of scale, metrics, finance, and joint accountability between developed and developing countries. Since they were established 10 years ago, the developing world has seen many breakthroughs, as have been discussed in some detail already. We've seen hundreds of millions of people lifted out of conditions of extreme poverty. We've seen massive expansion in global health efforts. We've seen dramatic inroads in the fight against disease. We've seen extraordinary progress in areas of access to water in some countries in particular. And there are many, many successes that many thought were impossible before the goals came to fruition. The challenge today is to accelerate progress in the poorest countries where the MDGs are not on track. In general, the starkest gaps are in the areas of agricultural productivity, maternal health and health systems, water, and economic infrastructure for growth in the poorest countries. I'd be pleased to share more details with the committee regarding these programs and successes and gaps, but for now, let me stress that these are the areas where an especially concerted push is needed. The MDGs should be, but have not been, a strategic priority for the United States. They have a complicated history in this country. In 2002, the spirit of the goals was incorporated into the establishment and naming of, indeed, the Millennium Challenge Account, and in turn the Millennium Challenge Corporation, although that institution has not in practice focused on the Millennium Development Goals. The wording disconnect has even caused confusion in much of Washington, since millennium, as a word, tends to be associated with the growing pains of a new institution rather than the internationally agreed targets that have been driving the global anti-poverty agenda throughout the rest of the world. Nonetheless, in 2002, President Bush joined world leaders in Monterrey, Mexico, and committed the United States, along with other developed countries, to make concrete efforts towards the target of 0.7% of gross national product as official development assistance to developing countries. Fortunately, the Millennium Goals are feasible within this commitment, since the financing requirements are modest, approximately 0.5% of the rich countries' collective national incomes. 0.5%. However, U.S. foreign assistance continues to rank among the very lowest of advanced economies at 0.2% of national income. Few people outside of Washington are aware that as a share of national income, U.S. foreign assistance actually hit its all-time low in 1997. Under the Bush administration, the U.S. made an important change in direction, led by targeted and focused programs that tackled challenges of HIV/AIDS and malaria in particular, through both bilateral programs and multilateral programs, such as the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. Congress's bipartisan commitment to global health is to be applauded. It has had a significant multiplier effect in leveraging additional commitments from around the world. The Obama administration has continued its predecessor's support for global health, although there are concerns that the support in this area is flatlining much too prematurely. The Obama administration has also played a pivotal role in advancing the global agriculture agenda. The US situation can be compared, for example, to the UK situation, where Prime Minister Cameron and the Conservative government in coalition has taken on the 0.7 target to be achieved by 2013. In the most recent budget, the government confirmed that it would not carry its fiscal consolidation program on the backs of the world's poorest people, and it actually protected both health and international development while making dramatic cuts throughout the rest of the government to consolidate its fiscal position. Millennium Promise was created amidst this backdrop of global support for the MDGs, the Millennium Goals, co-founded by Mr. Raymond Chambers, the path-breaking business leader, and Professor Jeffrey Sachs, the eminent economist, bringing together many others like Donald Keough, the former CEO of Coca-Cola, Quincy Jones, the music legend, and many others from Columbia University, the UN Development Program, and so forth. As the chairman said, we convened many people across Africa to work with nearly 500,000 local villagers across 10 countries to implement an integrated approach of low-cost, high-impact interventions. The results have been tremendous. A tripling of basic maize yields, more than a 50% reduction in malaria prevalence, a threefold increase in access to improved drinking water, and a remarkable one-third reduction in child malnutrition. This has drawn upon partnerships from leading private philanthropists such as Mr. George Soros, from corporate partners like Ericsson, which is bringing 3G connectivity to villages across Africa, Sumitomo Chemical, which has piloted the mass distribution of bed nets, Agrium and Mosaic, which are making major contributions of fertilizer, and Tommy Hilfiger, which is supporting programs directly. These lessons of success have fed into a much broader movement, and the strategy of partnership is crucial for the goals to be achieved from both public and private leaders. We've seen efforts like Malaria No More take shape, chaired now by Peter Chernin, the former president of News Corp, who's provided magnificent leadership with many celebrities, government leaders, private foundations like the UN Foundation to make a major breakthrough in malaria control. We've seen the World Economic Forum's community of young global leaders take on a people's plan of action for the Millennium Development Goals, with the idea that every person has the ability and a responsibility to make a measurable, action-oriented pledge to the goals. Less than 2 months before the summit, the world has been anxiously awaiting the United States to present its draft action plan. The administration recently presented a 2-page outline of its strategy, but this is only a loose statement of general directions. If the U.S. is to provide leadership for the MDGs, it is imperative that the government presents a draft action plan in a matter of days, not weeks. So I'd like to conclude, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, by offering a few suggestions for that draft action plan. First, fully fund the Feed the Future strategy, in particular through the new multilateral Global Agriculture and Food Security Program. Second, support a new global fund for education, as proposed by President Obama and Secretary Clinton, and include secondary education in its mandate with a special focus on girls. Third, continue to scale up the U.S. global health leadership by focusing on the problems that still need to be solved. That includes full financing for the programs PEPFAR and PMI for AIDS and malaria, and increasing the annual contribution to the Global Fund from $1 billion to $2 billion a year, recognizing that $1 from the U.S. leverages $2 from other advanced economies. And crucially, also endorsing the Secretary General's proposed joint action plan for child, maternal, and newborn health, and carry that forward by creating a new multilateral effort on maternal and child health anchored in the Global Fund, with initial U.S. financing of $2 billion per year, again leveraging the 1-to-2 ratio that comes with other financing crowding in with the U.S. Fourth, support a major scale-up of African economic infrastructure with U.S. funding of at least $5 billion per year, including allocations through the World Bank and the African Development Bank. Fifth, work with African countries to support holistic rural development strategies like the Millennium Villages. Sixth, launch a new MDG Innovation Fund to scale up successful programs that present new delivery mechanisms for MDG achievement in low-income countries. And seventh, and finally, set a 12-month timetable for the proposal and adoption of a proper international mechanism to achieve the water and sanitation Millennium Development Goals. Thank you so much for allowing me to share these thoughts today, and I look forward to discussing them further.
Thank you. And next, I'd like to recognize Dr. Scott Ratzan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. On behalf of Johnson & Johnson, I really appreciate the opportunity for you calling this important hearing and inviting us to share our thoughts and perspectives of achieving the UN Millennium Development Goals. Particularly, we'd like to talk about how public-private partnerships, or Mr. Chairman, as you call public-private interventions or initiatives, can play a significant role. And we appreciate your leadership, Mr. Chairman, in supporting efforts to address the MDGs. The challenges we face as a global community to achieve the MDGs, particularly in maternal and child health, are great. And the MDGs that relate to women and children's health are lagging furthest behind. For example, a woman in an underdeveloped country is 300 times more likely to die during childbirth or from pregnancy-related complications than her counterpart in a developed country. Bold, focused, and coordinated action is required to accelerate progress on the MDGs related to health. With only 5 years left until 2015 to achieve the MDGs, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon initiated a new global effort on women and children's health titled Investing in Our Common Future, Joint Plan of Action for Women and Children's Health. Johnson & Johnson was one of the 2 representatives of the private sector initially selected to participate in the Secretary General's initiative, joining others from throughout the United Nations, member states, and key civil society actors. I co-chair the Innovation Working Group of the UN Joint Action Plan, along with Tori Goodall, who's Special Advisor on Global Health to the Prime Minister of Norway. This group includes representatives from USAID, the United Nations, Canada, Rwanda, India, Harvard University, Rockefeller and Gates Foundation, and others. The Innovation Working Group has published draft papers that promote ideas that should catalyze future opportunities for the MDGs. They're available on a website, and they'll be published later this year. And we've made these available, Mr. Chairman, to the committee. There's 10 different ones that are here with a variety of perspectives, again, to foster innovation. We know that progress in developing and delivering healthy pregnancies and healthier babies is possible with innovation. Some of the poorest countries are now making significant reductions in maternal and neonatal mortality. Country-led as well as global innovations can achieve further reductions, enabling health services to produce better outcomes at the same cost that we have today. These range from financial incentives to promote performance and results to innovative use of mobile phones and other communication tools, some of which you've already heard about. These working papers include ways to improve effective services for women and children, including improving health literacy, the development and use of new technologies, as well as innovation and delivery of services through public-private initiatives. Johnson & Johnson has a long legacy of engaging in public-private partnerships focused on maternal and child health initiatives in many developing and developed countries. All of these have a focus of making life-changing, long-term, sustainable differences in human health and tied to advancing one or more of the Millennium Development Goals. Our approach focuses on working with community-based partners that have the greatest insights into the needs of local populations and the strategies that stand the greatest chances of success. Some of our examples of our activities include contributions in microbicide development, HIV prevention, helping children attain their utmost potential by treating and preventing intestinal worms, efforts to halt the scourge of tuberculosis, and initiatives to prevent mother-to-child transmission of HIV. I'll go through 4 of these examples. The first is from 2004, when Johnson & Johnson established a first-of-its-kind partnership with the International Partnership on Microbicides to provide a royalty-free license and technology transfer to develop, manufacture, and distribute its compound, TMC 120, as a topical vaginal microbicide to help protect women from infection with HIV in developing countries. We were the first pharmaceutical company, and this effort spearheaded other companies to follow suit with further contribution of their compounds to the IPM partnership. And as you may have heard last week in Vienna, microbicides have a promising approach to halting the incidence of HIV. Secondly, since 2006, we've partnered with the Task Force for Global Health on Children Without Worms. This is the first and only entity to focus specifically on global treatment and prevention of soil-transmitted helminthitis, or commonly known as intestinal worms. STH, or soil-transmitted helminthitis, contributes to general weakness, malnutrition, iron deficiency, anemia, and impaired physical and intellectual development in school-age children. The program that we've helped develop is treating approximately 20 million people with mebendazole, a drug developed by our pharmaceutical business, and is working to stop the cycle of reinfection through health education, access to clean water, and improved sanitation infrastructures. And this is currently active in 8 countries that have high prevalence rates. Third, as the new drugs for development of drug-resistant tuberculosis are in dire need, Johnson & Johnson formed a landmark collaboration with the Global Alliance for TB Drug Development, a not-for-profit product development partnership to accelerate the discovery and development of new drugs to fight tuberculosis. This collaboration is maximizing the expertise and resources from both the public and private sectors with the intent to improve the treatment of one of the world's oldest and most deadly diseases. We're sharing expertise and resources in the development of a novel Johnson & Johnson compound in development, and this is heralded as the first new tuberculosis drug with a new mechanism of action in 40 years. And finally, Mr. Chairman, a final example that we'd like to talk about contributes to how we've helped eliminate mother-to-child vertical transmission of HIV by 2015, which has also been heralded as a goal by the United Nations. For several years, J&J has partnered with the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation and Mothers to Mothers. Our partnership has reached more than 1.9 million women with counseling, provided more than 1.7 million with HIV testing, and administered antiretroviral prophylaxis to nearly 140,000 HIV-positive mothers in 11 countries. J&J also became Mother to Mother's first corporate partner in 2006 and is one of the largest supporters, as this partnership has reached over 3,500 new HIV-positive mothers each month in South Africa, Lesotho, and Swaziland. Each of these examples demonstrates how actors in the public and private sectors drive innovative solutions to address some of the world's most pressing global health issues affecting women and children. These partnerships all call for a shared vision, strategic thinking, and collaboration to be successful. Healthy partnerships leverage the unique skills that each partner brings to the table to effect change. We believe the best value comes when the United Nations and other governmental bodies involve the private sector to catalyze efforts, and when the private sector leverages governmental investments. We see this in our engagement with the United Nations and other stakeholders, including the U.S. government on health literacy initiatives. And Mr. Chairman, health literacy is something not only heralded domestically in the United States in health reform and in the National Action Plan with HHS, but also led efforts in Missouri with some of the great state innovations that Missouri is also sharing with the world, and vice versa. We also believe that our efforts at Johnson & Johnson in global health diplomacy drive new ways of thinking that can help shape stronger, more sustainable approaches benefiting mothers and fathers around the world. The recent resolution adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on prevention and control of non-communicable diseases stresses the need for a multi-sectoral response also to combat non-communicable diseases. In this resolution, the UN recognizes the enormous human suffering caused by non-communicable diseases, such as cardiovascular diseases, cancers, chronic respiratory diseases, and diabetes, and the threat they pose to the achievement of the MDGs. We see this challenge of non-communicable diseases and support the multi-sectoral input currently being developed by the United Nations and the World Health Organization. Johnson & Johnson represents the pharmaceutical industry with our seat on the World Health Organization's NCD-Net, a global non-communicable disease network developed. We also further contribute with our leadership to the World Economic Forum, chairing the chronic disease and wellness activities. The World Economic Forum has designated the threat of non-communicable diseases to economic and health and well-being, and we also now welcome more engagement with the U.S. government, the UN, and other interested parties in this effort. The UN Joint Plan of Action for Women and Children's Health offers renewed hope for the future as the varied participants explore ways to build upon, revitalize, and secure new commitments from a range of influential partners, as well as provide organization and accountability for delivery at the highest levels. During the formative stages, participants agree that this joint action plan should focus on increased political commitment and accountability, integrated delivery, and enhanced financing for women and children's health. In conclusion, I would like to remind, as we believe, that global health and development are too important to relegate to any one group. Congress has an important opportunity to support and encourage more public-private partnerships in health literacy, in maternal and child health, and other related areas that can help address the Millennium Development Goals. Additionally, it is critically important to foster public-private partnerships that build more integrated program offerings that focus less on trying to solve just one issue and more on holistic approaches to address the many challenges facing women and children in resource-poor settings. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And finally, I'd like to recognize Mr. James Roberts for 5 minutes. To hit your mic.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, for this opportunity to appear before your subcommittee. In my opinion, Congress should reject approval of future taxpayer-funded U.S. government official development assistance programs, or ODA, that are designed to achieve the UN MDGs. I should note at the outset I do not include emergency and humanitarian assistance in my critique of ODA. I'd also like to compliment the significant positive role in development played by private charities and faith-based groups. No one disputes the desirability of MDG goals, but there is significant disagreement about the best approach to achieve them. In my opinion, the UN programs will fail to achieve their objectives. If Congress continues to fund them, the only certainty is that they will further enrich corrupt elites in developing countries, and they will provide continuing employment for a cadre of development assistance bureaucrats and other professionals who are advancing them. Increasingly, experts in the developing world, such as Dambisa Moyo of Zambia, who wrote a book recently called Dead Aid, are voicing opposition to ODA. They know from firsthand experience that 50-plus years of foreign aid from OECD countries, totaling anywhere from 1.6 to 2.0 trillion dollars, and depending on who your source is, has only strengthened corrupt elites, encouraged morally corrosive cultures of corruption, discouraged private and foreign and domestic investment, and actually contributed to a rise in poverty rates because of the expanded level of non-productive government spending and the welfare dependency mindset that encourages. One has only to drive 50 miles or so beyond the Beltway in Washington for evidence of the massive government stimulus spending in the United States in recent years and its failure. Although it's been a boon to public sector unions, it has failed to help the average American to achieve his or her own set of MDGs. So why should anyone expect U.S. government deficit-financed development assistance programs that emphasize welfare state redistribution solutions and dependency to be any more successful in other countries? This is especially true at a time of unthinkably large U.S. deficits, as Congressman Rayburn mentioned. A Swedish development economist, Friedrich Segerfeldt, has noted the failure to lift people out of poverty and has analyzed the reasons why. And his conclusion, and we share it at Heritage, is that these problems of development in these countries simply cannot be solved by foreign aid. Only economic growth can rescue the poor and extremely poor, and that growth cannot be generated by statist development assistance programs that center on an ever-expanding welfare state and redistribution. Segerfeldt points out, for example, in 1962, GDP per capita in East Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa was roughly the same. By 2005, the poverty rate in East Asia had been dramatically reduced, while in sub-Saharan Africa it was more or less unchanged. The difference? China, South Korea, the so-called Asian tigers, other countries in East Asia generally did not follow the Western development assistance model. They preferred to stimulate growth through investment and export. Meanwhile, countries in sub-Saharan Africa have become increasingly dependent on ODA. Development assistance proponents push the MDGs, and they downplay extensive evidence that growth, not aid, provides the exit from the poverty trap. For evidence, look no further than the UN Millennium Declaration, which the UN Development Program purports to be the gold standard of development assistance policy prescriptions. It does not contain a single reference to economic growth. Only fundamental changes in a country's culture and political philosophy by its own citizens can accomplish these necessary changes. It is not just formal institutions of a government in developing countries, but the informal customs governing day-to-day business transactions that must be reformed. And that can only be accomplished by people living there. The U.S. taxpayer should not be put on the hook for that. If a country's culture and practices are steeped in corruption and cronyism, no amount of aid will overcome it. In fact, ODA actually degrades these formal and informal institutions the longer it exists, because it tends to perpetuate corrupt regimes that can hang on to power by using the assistance flows. It's instructive to look at the countries where the Millennium Development Goals have actually been realized most fully in the history of the world. And that would be in the developed countries with high levels of economic freedom and low levels of corruption. And of course, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, I work on the Index of Economic Freedom, which annually analyzes these core principles: rule of law, secure property rights, limited government, taxes as low as possible, efforts to encourage and bolster free markets, entrepreneurship, democratic governance, political stability, and the resulting prosperity. According to our index, countries with greater improvements in economic freedom achieve much higher reductions in poverty. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, the deficit is a major concern, and no one is going to be deluded into thinking that even if the entire U.S. foreign assistance budget were eliminated, and I don't recommend that, it would not solve our deficit problem. But most of it should be eliminated on principle. I make an exception certainly for direct, short-term U.S. national security goals that should be tackled by joint U.S. military and civilian agency teams. But other than that, and maybe a few other exceptions, I think that it's been actually development assistance policies have been a block to growth and to lifting people out of poverty. The best thing the United States can do right now is to help the developing world is to get its own financial house in order and regain its status as a role model for developing countries. Take the lead among OECD countries to end ineffective ODA programs. Instead, encourage more trade and investment, for example, by approving the pending free trade agreements with Panama, Colombia, and South Korea, and negotiating more. That will make more capital available to the private sector and spur a renewed level of economic growth in the U.S. and globally. That is the best model for sustainable development through economic growth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate our panel and all of your diverse backgrounds and opinions. I think we've covered a lot here, but I'm going to start with recognizing myself for 5 minutes of questions. And I want to start out asking each of you, as has been mentioned in various forums, about the security and economic connection to these goals. And I know you quoted Secretary Gates, but I'd like each of you to talk about that, and also the third component, how this helps leverage other aid. I also like the comment that was made that this was too big for any one group to do on its own. I think that's an important theme here. But if you could each address that, and I'll start with Ms. Calvin.
So sorry. I believe Secretary Gates had it exactly right when he made the critical connection between ensuring that there are peaceful and conflict-free areas in the world where we can help nations grow to their full potential and their citizens live to their full potential, and to become eventually some customers and clients of U.S. companies. But I think the most important thing here is the recognition that people around the world are all of equal value, and that we need to address that basic core instinct that Americans have. Once we make a nation have access to the health and other benefits that we're talking about here, we know that we can encourage the keeping of girls and other young people in school, which leads to long-term security and stability in a country. A lot of the work that the U.S. ODA is already doing is in the area of democracy building and rule of law, and we know that those two things then work hand in hand. And it's important to recognize that so much of ODA is currently not even in the areas that my colleagues have talked about, even though it's been increased in recent years around AIDS treatment and other areas. It's been a full panoply of supporting the economic growth of these countries in lots of different ways. And the most important way we can help a country grow economically is to make sure that its citizens are educated and have health.
Great. Dr. McArthur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. These are terrific questions, and I would just start by saying that I think official development assistance and aid often is very broadly misunderstood as a charitable endeavor. There certainly are humanitarian emergencies which require that form of logic, but what we are really talking about here is investments, and investments in very specific and practical programs and targets. If we even look at the challenge of economic growth for the poorest countries and communities in the world, the majority of them are farmers. economic growth to a farmer means growing a better crop, literally. And so when we're talking about agriculture, for example, and support for agriculture, that has a double dividend of both tackling hunger and promoting economic growth. Now, Malawi is a very important example. Malawi supported with the President Mutharika put forward a program to make sure every small farmer in Malawi got access to a bag of fertilizer and a can of seeds. You couldn't think of anything more simple and straightforward. This was only made possible because of international support. That program then doubled the country's food production, and in 2008, when the global economy was imploding, Malawi grew at 9%. So the economic dividend is very important, and the fact that agriculture has basically been missing from the international agenda for a generation is, in my view, one of the deepest reasons why we haven't seen more direct links between foreign aid and growth. Now, we certainly need the longer-term support for education and health as well, which will undoubtedly affect growth in the medium and longer term where the programs are successful, because children that survive and are better educated will be very active economic players, and even higher child survival is linked to lower fertility rates, which is part of managing a demographic transition, where we have the fastest growing populations in the poorest countries, the greatest risks of instability are also in those poor countries. And we don't just have to think about these countries as islands, because they're very much part of a connected world. Now, if we look at the evidence, which is quite strong and in the top journals, the risk of conflict and civil conflict is much higher at lower levels of income per capita. Many of the places that we read about in the newspaper every day, which are our direct security interests, also happen to be those places. There's an extra overlay, which is the climate issue. The top research now shows that risk of climate, whether it's temperature, whether it's rainfall variation, especially in Africa, is directly linked statistically to the onset of conflict and domestic conflict. And the logic is quite straightforward. When the rains fail or the temperature is too high, the crops fail, and hungry people are ultimately more likely to fight. And we have a whole drylands issue throughout the Sahel, where these are also the hot-button security places that we're worried about on both sides, or on all sides of our foreign policy. So we need to understand that there's a direct effect on health and delivery targets and education and infrastructure. We also need to understand that aid can go and must go directly to supporting the productive sectors, and that won't just help these countries escape from aid and graduate from the need for support, but will also help them develop the robust kind of economic and social capacity that will really be in our global long-term interest for stability.
Thank you. Dr. Ratzan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that's an excellent question that leads to what we encompass under global health diplomacy. Notwithstanding the ideas of health as a bridge to peace, health with conflict resolution, but the idea that health investments are investments in wealth and economic well-being. And there's basically three areas where I think this makes the largest and best example. One is infectious disease, which has no borders. Second, chronic disease, which continues to be a threat. And thirdly, as you mentioned, mother's education, or as we link even more with health literacy in general. We looked at last year's risk report, which is done annually with the World Economic Forum, that goes to both private sector groups as well as governments from throughout the world. And if you look at the risk report, it puts on one axis the potential or the likeliness of something to occur, and on the other axis, the threat that it is to society with economic well-being. And what's highest on that list are three health-related areas: chronic disease, pandemics, and some of the threats that Dr. McArthur mentioned related to climate change. It is higher than some of the economic collapse items that are there, yet the world does not invest the same in the fundamentals of health and economic well-being to help prevent those risks. So what we're trying to do is integrate some of the activities that I mentioned. With tuberculosis, we cannot do this alone. Multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis could come into the United States. It could threaten the world in a broader way, and areas that we've heard in the past of extremely drug-resistant tuberculosis that has been a threat for communicable disease. Chronic disease, mostly at this juncture, it tends to be diabetes, but notwithstanding tobacco use and the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, another piece that was heralded by both the United Nations and World Health Organization with their authority, where also countries could help make a difference in preventing cancer and treatment for mortality and morbidity related to tobacco. And then thirdly, health literacy. The United Nations resolution last year relating to health literacy can make a major difference in better health outcomes, has spearheaded efforts in China with 66 indicators for health literacy, United States National Action Plan, 8 member states in Europe, and other countries that are looking at ways that if we just educate and give people the knowledge and the skills and simplify the demands and complexity of the system, we can also have better health outcomes and better economic well-being. So those are the 3 areas that I think could help make a difference and really do link the overall security and economic connection to the MDGs.
Okay, and Mr. Roberts.
Thank you. Since the end of World War II, really the best ally and friend of people all over the world has been a strong United States, strong economically, diplomatically, and militarily. The United States has kept the air and sea lanes open, which has spurred globalization. And that has been that globalization, that investment in trade has been what has really helped people and lifted them out of poverty. And it's been hundreds of millions of people, as I'm sure no one would disagree with. And those flows of investment and trade flows dwarf a combined ODA of the whole world, as you also know. But the biggest threat right now to the United States national security are the deficits in this country that could lead to our financial ruin. Cutting ODA will be only one of probably thousands of budget and spending cuts, difficult and painful, that Congress will likely have to confront in order to restore U.S. economic prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Mr. Rohrbacher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How much is it that you think that we should be spending that we're not spending? I mean, Dr. McArthur, you were relatively hard on your country here in terms of we're not doing our, so what level of spending are we at now and what would you want us to spend at?
The international commitment is to 0.7%.
No. The actual amount. I mean, I'm not talking about, I understand the percentage of your economy. No.
Right.
How much do we spend now? How much do you want us to spend?
Right. So the numbers would be current development assistance is on the order of $30 billion. I can get the specifics.
Okay, so currently we spend $30 billion.
Right.
And you would want us to spend?
It would be closer to $100 billion.
Closer to $100 billion. Yeah. Okay. And when you're talking about our contribution to the world, you're not including some of the things Mr. Roberts was alluring to, that we send our military forces throughout the world in order to prevent conflicts from overwhelming regions.
I should clarify, those are...
Because we spent $1 trillion in Iraq.
Right.
Okay, and we're spending, hundreds of billions of dollars in Afghanistan, and you don't count that really as a contribution. You think that it has to be in the form of grain seed.
That's not what I said.
Okay.
Congressman, excuse me. I would, just to clarify, I think we're talking about complementary strategies. And so that's why I think the testimony of Secretary Gates is so important, because we're talking about both security and development for security. The reality is that there's about a 30-to-1 ratio of the military expenditures to the development expenditures. Yeah. No one is questioning the importance of the defense spending, far from it.
Yeah.
I
read Secretary Gates' remarks, and let me just note, it does exemplify the difference in approach that honest people have in terms of how to find prosperity and peace in the world. I think Secretary Gates does not fully, and other people have not fully understood, that Adolf Hitler came from a developed country. The communists who were in power generally came from upper middle income families and upper income families. And the radical Islamic movement today is not fed on poverty, but instead on fanaticism that is being financed by some of the wealthiest groups of people on the planet. And so I would disagree with him that poverty leads to this type of national security challenges that we face today. Now, we can still believe that it is the humanitarian responsibility of people who have been blessed to live in free societies and have prosperity to help those in less free societies. I disagree with him as that's as a strategy for a more peaceful world. Let me just go back, and with all due respect, Doctor, the idea that you presented, this image of, well, what they really need is a sack of fertilizer, is probably the most naive approach that leads to the waste of huge amounts of money that should be going to improve people's lives. Frankly, that a sack of fertilizer in most of these developing countries will lead, even if it leads to a little bit more production by that farmer, no, it's not growing a better crop. It happens to be also that people are taking bribes and demanding bribes from that farmer. The people who are stealing from that farmer legally and illegally. The lack of transportation because the money in that country, instead of going to transportation, has gone into the pockets of corrupt officials. The fact that they don't have clean water because those same corrupt officials have pocketed that money. No, it's not a sack of fertilizer. And until we begin realizing that those type of problems, which Mr. Roberts outlines, those things have more to do with the poverty than does the lack of sack of fertilizer. And from $30 billion to $100 billion may provide more fertilizer for those farmers at our expense, at the expense of our kids here. We're going to borrow that extra $70 billion. We're going to borrow it from China in order to help these people. And I would submit to you that that will not improve the life of those people that you're intending it to, and will actually bring down the quality of life of our own people. Let me ask you this, about the people who run these programs. We're talking about, by the way, let me congratulate anybody around the world, anybody personally and anyone here domestically, who's engaged in helping other people with their own resources. And George Soros is a mixed bag. I mean, George Soros manipulated the currency in various developing countries, impoverishing certain people in those countries, but at the same time, he has been a great contributor to various humanitarian causes. And I realize there's when you're talking about it, but Ted Turner has done some wonderful things. The Bill Gates Foundation has done some wonderful things. We applaud their activity, especially if they're doing it unilaterally on their own, going out and trying to make their money count. But when we're talking about these joint programs, how much money goes into administration? For example, someone who runs some of the programs that you're talking about, do they make more money than a congressman makes? How much money do they make? Do they make over $100,000 a year? Should we set a cap on any organization that we are in a partnership with, that they won't be paying their executives a certain amount of money? So what about the pay level of the people who may just be sucking off that money that should be going into fertilizer for that farmer in Africa?
I'm very glad you raised these points, so thank you. And I would say, first of all, no one is advocating money for process, and no one is advocating a penny go to corruption. And that has to be very clear. This is about results and direct auditable, monitorable, deliverable targets that you can do a spot check on to make sure it's happening where it should. That has been the great success, I would say, of the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, which the Congress had played such a crucial role on, is it was about actually making sure that those people get the antiretroviral medicines. And this was deemed less than a decade ago, as you know, I'm sure much better than me, impossible. And now we have 5 million people on AIDS treatment thanks to a breakthrough program where it was about auditable results and delivery metrics. For fertilizer and so forth, I actually, with utmost respect, have a different read on the history, where throughout Asia, going back to Korea in the 1930s, Taiwan in the 1920s, India and Pakistan in the 1960s, every single case of economic takeoff that wasn't about discovering a mine was linked to strong public support, public investments in agriculture and smallholder agriculture. Norman Borlaug, the Nobel laureate who won the Presidential Medal of Freedom, was the great leader with M.S. Swaminathan around India, making sure literally that farmers got fertilizer and seed. Literally, that was the program. So with utmost respect, I don't believe it's a naive view, I believe it's a practical view linked to actually what's the monitorable, auditable program delivery target. And in Malawi, the government has used a voucher system with even biometrics in place to make sure that this is an efficient system. And that has been a breakthrough in a country that was previously considered the perfect storm of disasters. So I think we need to have a very hard-headed approach. And I, with full candor, I used to write the Global Competitiveness Report. I'm a macroeconomist. I believe in economic growth as much as anyone. But what I'm supporting is a view that thinks through what are the investments required to support robust long-term economic growth in the poorest countries while solving the practical problems. I believe that we have to be focusing on programs first, direct commodities. We have to be using local staff. This is not about armies of aid workers going from the rich countries. This is about local programs. In the Millennium Village Project, all of the staff in Africa are African. And that's a very crucial component of our work because there's so much expertise that just needs to be empowered by tools. I was in Tanzania a few weeks ago, and I was with a farmer who had 6 years of primary school education, who was a community health worker with a cell phone treating malaria in front of my eyes with new technologies. This was something that would never have been possible if it weren't for the Presidential Malaria Initiative or the Global Fund to make malaria treatment possible.
Thank you very much. I think my time is about expired, but let me note that we still have a disagreement, but it was a good comeback.
Thank you.
And I will also note that malaria, I mean, lots been said about malaria today. It hasn't escaped as many of us that when you get involved with these global projects and government programs, that the politically correct attitudes on things tend to take hold. And many of us believe that the malaria epidemic that we're facing now can be traced right back to the politically correct science of eliminating DDT, which once it was eliminated by people who have these politically correct notions, we saw a massive increase in the death of children in Africa. And so we're talking about millions of children here who've lost their lives by people who, of course, are part of this very benevolent approach, but mindset, liberal mindset, that has outlawed DDT in order to protect the thickness of bird shells. Yes, thank you very much.
I certainly enjoy the debate and discussion and give and take of this committee. Thank the gentleman and thank our witnesses. I want to talk about a success that has been mentioned here with regard to the global polio eradication initiative and the work that's been done with Rotary International, the WHO, CDC, and UNICEF. If you could comment on the success of that program that has seen polio plummet 99% since 1988, and what is needed to make that final push in the 4 remaining endemic countries, Afghanistan, India, Nigeria, Pakistan, and finally, what lessons can we learn from that program that we can apply to some of these others that are just really getting started? And I'm going to reverse the order this time and start with Mr. Roberts.
I would have to do some research on some of those specifics. I would refer the committee to the many scholarly works of Professor William Easterly at NYU, who is probably one of the best and most solid and robust economists who has written critically about these issues. And I would also note that, just in passing, that the PEPFAR is a good example of a program that worked well. And I think it did because it was private money, and it was private corporate management methods that were brought into the government, and it was fenced off from the rest of the government. And I think it was a good example of a program that worked. Although, as I've mentioned in my testimony, we have to make very difficult choices because of the budgetary reality we face. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Dr. Ratzan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's a very important question and something that, unfortunately, we've been unable to end polio in the last century. And ironically, I also edit a journal of health communication, and we just did a whole supplement.
Is there anything you don't do?
Thanks. We did a whole supplement with USAID and George Washington University Global Health on polio communication and what are the final challenges, to answer that question directly. And I can't summarize the 100 pages from experts in a peer-reviewed publication. But what I can say is that some of the fundamental areas that would help make a difference would be better communication, and most particularly this is political level communication, to get the leadership and community-based leaders able to understand the value of the polio vaccination. And that's been a very large challenge, not only with the anti-vaccine lobby, frankly, here in the United States, but really globally. The whole idea of vaccines making a difference and a challenge are continuing to be, not only for polio, but for other vaccine-preventable illnesses. And then finally, I think, and I do believe that the work at USAID and others have been quite successful in working in this public-private partnership, but we need the continued support to end polio, and part of that, again, is both political communication as well as efforts on the ground with community-based efforts.
Thank you. Dr. McArthur.
I'm not expert on polio, but I can say the general lesson on that program and others is that you have a few basic steps that come together. One is you have implementation of known technologies. The vaccine is very important. Two is you have developing country-driven national implementation strategies. That developing country ownership is central, and accountability. Third is that you have those national strategies regularly and rigorously evaluated through independent technical review. Fourth is that those programs are driven by a clear emphasis on performance metrics, so they're delivery targets that everyone's accountable for. And then fifth, they have adequate finance through, in this instance, a blend of public and private sectors, but we can't expect these programs to be implemented in the absence of adequate finance. And so the dollars are not about throwing dollars, they're about funding very practical mechanisms.
I'll add a
Ms.
few.
Cowan.
Happy to add a few lessons. The UN Foundation's been involved in the fight against polio since its inception. But, you know, really, the Rotary International deserves the largest credit here for jumping on this in 1988 with World Health Organization. I would say the most important thing that was done initially was that a goal was set and that the world rallied around it, following on the success of smallpox elimination, which prior to polio was the only major disease ever eliminated in the United States and the world. Second, an infrastructure was built that we have since built upon to eliminate measles and other diseases, and to build a health systems infrastructure that now works in the countries where polio was done. And third, because it was public and private, Rotary showed it's not just the money that they could raise in this country and around the world, and they've raised over $600 million, but it's that they used their volunteers around the world to help deliver the vaccine, and that made a huge difference. The hurdles have been cultural. At some point, someone went to the annual pilgrimage and exposed others at the Hajj to polio, and Saudi Arabia responded by having a rule now that you can't come to the Hajj unless you've had polio vaccination, and they've stepped up to help eliminate it in the Muslim areas where it's been endemic. We need every country to recognize how important it is that we reach this goal, and we see that in the countries where it is still endemic, which tend to have largely Muslim populations, the religious leaders have been both at initially the problem and now are helping us get to that final stage. We think we'll get there. It's taken also some efforts to refresh the campaign, and the Gates Foundation most recently stepped in to really make this a major effort and initiative of theirs, making this point that the public-private partnership is what really multiplies the impact of U.S. money. And the U.S. has been the biggest donor in this space, and I would say this is an investment well worth making.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher.
I didn't quite get, we covered some of the other areas of my questions, so I didn't quite get to the salaries of people. Should we have a cap on salaries for people, in private institutions, if they want to pay their people $250,000, $300,000 a year, that's their business, as long as they're doing that independently of government. But if you have an institution that's in partnership with government, should we not have a cap on salaries for these charitable institutions so that the people there are not making more than their counterparts in government?
Well, I don't believe in a cap myself. I believe in disclosure. I believe in measurement and accountability, and I believe in reform. And I think part of what U.S. aid should be all about is making sure that our investments around the world are done in the best possible fashion. I think it's important that we're doing the Foreign Assistance Act to look at that. I don't think a cap is necessarily the right solution in every case, because I don't even know how you'd pick it.
Okay, so you don't believe that we should have, if the government is going to go into a partnership with a private organization, that we should require that that private organization does not utilize, does not consume its resources on salaries for its top executives at a level that's higher than what you find in the government.
Well, I agree with what you're saying. I just don't know if a cap is the right answer to that. I think that absolutely should be one of the judgments
So you're
and
against
measurements.
that. You're against that. John, Dr. McArthur?
Are you referring to organizations in the advanced countries or in the local economies?
Talking about people who we've been talking about partnerships between the private groups and government, and at our level and at international level. Should there be a cap on the pay levels of those private organizations if indeed they are going into this partnership? By the way, if they aren't in a partnership, they can pay whatever they darn well want. But if we are, talking about partnership here today, if that's what you're advocating, would you advocate that we put a cap on the salaries of those top people in those organizations so that they aren't making more money than their government counterparts?
It's a question I don't have a specific answer to, I would say, in that
Then it's a no. If you don't have a specific answer, it's a no, because this is a policy, and so if you're not for it, that means you're not for the policy.
Well, I'd be happy to follow up with you on it to think through all the mechanics of what it could include, because I think it's a very important question. I spent a lot of time thinking about what different salary scales could look like based on value for money, and whether it's hiring a community health worker who's a farmer part-time in a village, whether it's a Ph.D. working in rural Africa who's a local African Ph.D.
No, I'm actually talking more about your organizations,
Right.
not the guys down in Africa. I'm saying that should people who work for, if the Turner Foundation and other groups that are in private sector here are going to be partners with the U.S. government, should we expect that the money that they're consuming as part of that charitable operation not be consumed via top-level salaries as compared to, and the standard you would use would be their counterparts in the public sector?
So I would say to that any public funding that goes through a partner organization, it makes good sense to me that that be aligned with U.S. Government salary pay scales. If there's a privately funded organization where private supporters want to pay at their discretion,
Understand, but you're
I'm dividing, I'm segmenting the problem.
Yeah,
Yes.
right. The fact is that if you are in a partnership, you are, that the program, your programs are tied, and I'm just saying if you're going to tie your programs, should we not also tie how much money is being consumed for upper-level salaries? What have you doctor, what would you say? And by the way, let me just note, I commended the Turner Foundation and others. I forgot to say Johnson & Johnson Foundation, because you guys are doing terrific work, and you can be proud of the good things that your company and the foundation of Johnson & Johnson has been doing. And you've expressed that today, and we've heard that, and that's wonderful. So pardon me for not adding you on the list of people to commend.
Thank you very much, Congressman Rohrabacher. In response to your question, I think we have to look at this very broad issue of how healthcare and health services are delivered throughout the world. And frankly, a lot of it is delivered through the private sector. So the partnership might be, in some cases, public funding and private sector delivery. Other cases, it's private sector funding and then public sector interventions and research and so forth. So there is no one solution that exists. And we are always in seeking out the best quality people and resources throughout the world. And with that, free market activities clearly are in place.
So let's get down to the basic question.
So-
if you're in a partnership, if you got a private foundation or whatever it is in partnership, as we're advocating today, as a joint effort with government, should the government put a cap and saying we're not going to be in partnership with a charitable organization that pays its top-level executives more than their government counterparts?
We don't get into the governance nor a litmus test of partnerships based upon funding at that level. So we would not advocate for
But we do actually take a look. The government does say, well, here's a foundation that is spending 90% of its money or 75% or whatever the money, they're consuming it among their own executives, thus we're not going to get in a partnership with them. I'm sure that happens, so that's been a no as well. Now, Mr. Roberts.
Well, Congressman, it may not come as a surprise to you that I would say yes, that they would have to be bound. And I think your point, and I'm sure you know this better than I, that what you're illustrating is a larger problem and real threat and danger, and that is of a creeping cronyism, of a state corporatism that we're seeing with these public-private ideas, a corporate social responsibility. It's really the government trying to take over, in a sense, these assets that are privately held that belong to shareholders. And so, of course, we oppose that at Heritage, as you would.
Let me just note, and I know my time has been used up here, but just a little story that really indicates why I think this thing. Years ago, when I was 19, I spent some time with some projects in Vietnam, and it's a long time ago, different life. And I'd been up in the Central Highlands, and I was really, just a long way from home, and I was taking a flight to Bangkok, and I met a guy on the airplane, and he said, hey, where you come from? And I told him I was up there with the Montagnards and all this stuff. And he says, well, my wife, he's American. He says, my wife actually can cook a great American meal. Would you like to come over for some meatloaf? And oh, yes, that's terrific. Okay, I'd love to have that. So I went over to this. This guy was the head of UNICEF, I think it was, okay, in Bangkok. So I said, well, we'll catch a cab. He says, oh, no, I've got a car. Oh, he had a car. All right, he had a car, he had a driver, and it was a big car. So we got in the car, and we went to not his little house, his huge house with the fence around it and the servants. And then, look, I'm sure he's a wonderful guy, and the money that was going for these children's activities in Thailand, I'm sure he took his job seriously, but he was consuming a lot of that money himself. And he had a driver, he had a doorman, he had a cook, he had a housekeeper, he had a big house, and when we went in the middle of the meal, he says, how would you guys like some good whiskey? I said, well, all right. I'd been drinking this rice wine they have up with the Montagnards in the Central Highlands. So yeah, good whiskey, all right. He says, come with me. And he grabbed me by the arm, and we went out into the garage, and there were all these cases in the garage, and they were these boxes made out of wood, and they had children's books, UNICEF children's books, on the side of it. And he grabbed one, help me down with this, and he opened it up, and it was filled with whiskey. Now, all I'm saying is that, if we don't watch out, the people who are actually running the programs in a lot of these areas, what we found is that a lot of the times people come in, they say, well, we spent this much money in this area. It's really been consumed by the management of the organization. And you got to pay attention to that. If we really are serious and we want to help people, You can't just sit here and say, we really have to raise the money from 30 billion to 100 billion dollars. That may not make any impact at all, except at the debt level of these young people who are in the audience. And we got to have the courage to look at things, and especially have the courage to say, yeah, I don't think we should pay people. If this is going to be a charitable operation, those involved should be contributing to that charitable operation by actually receiving less pay than they would if they went into another endeavor. That's their contribution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And I want to go on to another tack, and I guess I'd like to ask the witnesses, with the 5 years left to achieve the MDGs, certainly we can all make the case that all of them are critically important, but given our limited time and limited resources, I'd like to ask you to prioritize what you think would be the most critical and the most achievable in these remaining 5 years. Ms. Calvin, let's start with you. Just try your mic again.
Got it. Thank you. I'll pick up on the last conversation to say not only do we need more money for all of this work, but we need to get more for our money. So more health for the money, I think, is the mission and the goal for the next 5 years. Vaccine interventions are probably going to be one of the most important pieces of that. We know that with vaccine interventions, we can prevent 8 million more deaths between now and 2020. So anything we can do to encourage the research and development, distribution, and uptake on vaccinations and immunizations around the world is critical. Second, I would say a focus on women and girls, which, Mr. Chairman, I know you did a hearing on this just a few weeks ago, is essential. I think we've all learned that if you can keep a girl in school, if you can prevent her from marrying too early, if you can give her the opportunity to structure and create her own life, you've not only impacted her and her family, but also her whole village. And so I think a whole focus and a lens looking at ensuring that women and girls, and particularly adolescent girls, are taken care of is essential. Third, I think we need to look at all of the goals in an integrated fashion. The goals were set up as 8 individual goals, but to some degree, they work most effectively, and countries and public-private partnerships will work most effectively if we can integrate our approaches and, again, get the most for our money. Fourth, I would say technology and the use of new modern technologies, whether it's mobile phones or others, is essential, and we've been negligent in not using that and thinking that we needed investments financially. There's many innovative solutions that ought to be taken forward, and we would encourage that. Finally, Goal 8 is something that we don't talk about as often as we talk about 1 through 7, and that's the one that has to do with trade and debt, and I think it's as important for this country to focus on those issues and help other countries move forward economically if we can. And fifth, I think, as Dr. McArthur said, the Millennium Development Goals are not just the UN's goals, not just America's goals, they are everyone's goals. So to the degree that there's an approach to these goals that everyone can adopt, and I think that's why we have young people sitting in this room, they understand that these are the goals that will affect their future. That's the way we need to approach it. Thank you.
Dr. McArthur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a great question. I would just submit that we have to avoid false choices when thinking through the goals. Just like, in my view, we should not make false choices between development and security. We have to think of both together. We have to think of fiscal sustainability and investments for the medium and long term. The goals are holistic, not just in there as a package, but also because they're essentially for self-reinforcing activities. So if you want to cut child mortality, clean drinking water is crucial. If you want to cut maternal mortality, girls' education is crucial, and vice versa. So these are very much a package, which is why we have to be careful not to cherry pick. I liken it to saying whether I want my heart, my lungs, my liver, my brain. I actually think I need all of them to function as a human being. Economies and societies need health, education, food, infrastructure, and so forth. So I think the holistic underpinning of the goals is essential, but back to Congressman Rohrabacher's point, I think the goal-based element is crucial. This isn't about anything other than delivery targets in the end, and every resource allocation should be linked to outcomes through action areas, and I think that's exactly the perfect logic for this. If I were to pick, with all of those points in mind, if I were to pick the areas that I think could make the greatest breakthroughs in the next few years, remembering how many breakthroughs have happened in the past 10 years and 5 years that we all thought were, or many people thought were just too hard, I think in agriculture, again, this is an area where the world can make a tremendous breakthrough. Africa as a continent could basically double its food production within 5 years. This is an extraordinary biophysical reality that we have not yet got our heads around as a global community. We could have second major breakthrough, I would say, in health systems and maternal health and child health, not by paying high salaries to people from rich countries, but by training millions of community health workers with very basic skills. It's called task shifting, so that they can do the simple life-saving interventions so that if that mother is about to deliver, they get to the clinic where that skilled birth attendant is. It's not just about the skilled birth attendant, it's about actually getting them to that skilled birth attendant if they're prepared to deliver at home. And then a third thing I would stress is the girls' education, and really emphasizing secondary education, which has so many transformative effects for health, for economic growth, for broader economic activity in a society. I don't want to say we don't need economic infrastructure, we don't need roads, we don't need ports, we don't need energy, because that's where the growth will come from. It will probably take a little longer for the international community to get its head around those systems that are needed, and also for water, which is technically probably the toughest problem, because drinking water is only a small share of the uses of water, where we're going to have a lot better water systems for agriculture, for industrial use, and so forth. But those would be my general recommendations on how to think through the breakthroughs that can happen in the next 5 years.
Thank you. Dr. Ratzan.
Thank you for the opportunity on this regard of what can be done. I think the previous witnesses have certainly talked about the holistic approach, and clearly that is necessary. And I know there's consideration with the Global Health Initiative of giving some flexibility for formation of public-private initiatives that could help address some of the areas that are both health-related, education-related, environmental-related, and so forth. And when I look at the Millennium Development Goals, for example, Millennium Development Goal 1 on poverty and hunger, amongst that it has nutrition-related factors and deworming. Those, frankly, have not got the same level of partnerships as maybe infectious disease has in the past. Millennium Development Goal 2, of course, dealing with education. Again, the idea of health literacy, the opportunity to empower women and mothers and fathers and so forth to have the information and skills to demand appropriate health services and to get the, whether it be clean water or transference and choice of vaccines and so forth. Millennium Development 3, gender equality and empowerment. Clearly, that's quite important. Also with health areas in terms of HIV and giving women the opportunity, not only with microbicides, but other preventing mother-to-child transmission. Child mortality obviously is broad and obviously a big emphasis that we have. HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. Number 6, I think we can make a difference in preventing mother-to-child transmission. And the charge that happened last week at the United Nations and WHO to eliminate this by 2015 is achievable if we put the right emphasis and funds and technical resources there, as well as helping foster the kind of research necessary for it. Amongst that, I think we need to presage the next phase, post-2015, when we'll have new interventions for HIV, such as pre-exposure prophylaxis, preventing HIV not just by choice of behaviors, but also by having technological and medical interventions with new medicines that could be delivered. And similarly with tuberculosis, of being able to shorten, whether it be course of therapy or also the transmission thereof. And then finally, I think the last two, with whether it be environmental sustainability or trade and debt, these are very, very important that we need to think about. That again, infectious disease has no borders, and whether it be SARS, whether it be a swine or H1N1 and H5N1, whatever might be there, it's not if this happened, it's when it happens, and these require fundamental health systems that are functioning and in place, and something where, while the United States has fundamentally been leading this with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and our epidemiologic service and so forth, we nonetheless also have to have the kind of fundamental health diplomacy that is the holistic approach of being able to work with both governments, with public health authorities, community health leaders, and others to address future health scourges. So I would say any investment in health is a wise investment. I think it will pay back not only the United States, but really, most importantly, the health of individuals and citizens throughout the world. And it's a positive opportunity to be able to speak and to share this today, and hopefully we can continue to have this global investment.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly don't want to minimize the suffering of the poor, but I do want to note that bureaucrats all over the world are always creating artificial action-forcing deadlines, such as this 5-year deadline. And I say that as a former bureaucrat myself. But I recall the Copenhagen climate change commitments, and that deadline, which sort of dropped dead date last December. Well, all that went by the wayside when China and India refused to go along, and at the same time, the ClimateGate scandal broke. And so I think we should solve these problems as quickly as we can, and we're financially capable of doing. And of course, I go back to the recommendations that were in my testimony for the best way to do it. Thank you.
Mr. Rohrabacher.
Thank you very much. What we're talking about basically is providing service to the world's poorest people and people who live in deprivation, and usually the deprivation coincides with the fact they also live under tyranny and under a corrupt government. Whether inoculations, clean water, deworming, all of these basically are services that should be provided by one's own government, or should be provided with the government working, their local government working in coordination with private sector groups such as your own. If we provide the services, if these young people are burdened with more debt, especially if we end up borrowing the money to provide these services and then expect these young people to pay taxes on it for the rest of their lives in order to provide these services on an ongoing basis, doesn't this mean that unless there is the reform that Mr. Roberts is talking about in their society, that as soon as we quit providing the services, the worms will come back, and the diseases will come back, and the dirty water will come back? Isn't that the case? Unless it's the reform he's talking about, no matter what we do temporarily to alleviate the current suffering, are we not just saddling our young people with this monstrous debt of burden of debt in order just to provide something that's going to go right back to its bad state anyway? Is that not the case? Go right ahead.
Well, I'll take on a couple of those. I mean, I hear exactly what you're saying, and probably the biggest buzzword in this whole area is sustainability, to make sure that anything that's done has a chance for being carried forward in the future. So a couple things. Obviously, we did eradicate smallpox, and systems were kept in place to ensure that it didn't come back. So that's got to be a goal that's put into every program.
It hasn't come back yet.
Hasn't come back yet.
The fact is that if we are not successful in much of the third world, it will come back. Just like malaria was almost eliminated as well, correct? I mean, malaria almost disappeared. Now, I mentioned that well, I think it was pretty well attacked in Africa as well. I mean, so the rates of malaria now have not gone up in the last 10 years in Africa? Yeah, they've dramatically risen in Africa in the last 10 years. Not that we eliminated it, but the fact is that the DDT decision, but that's different than the point I'm making.
So I want to agree with your point, basically, because I think you're right that this is the most important thing. So things like the Global Fund, which requires countries to submit a plan. And the plan is not just to get the money for the services they're seeking, but it's to show a plan for how they will continue the program going forward, how they will be investing, increasing parts of their own resources to make this a country-led plan in the future. So I think that's a shift that we're seeing.
So the corrupt dictator there
general.
someplace in one of these despotic little countries, the corrupt dictator, he has got to make that deal. But you know what happens when you're dealing with people who have the morality level that they murder their own people because they might have said something in opposition to the government? You know what the morality level, do you know what the chances of that leader keeping his word is? Almost zero, because he has no morality. There are large numbers of people in power in various parts of the world who murder their own constituents, you might say, and if there was any threat to their power. And they're not going to keep their word in that anyway, unless we, so in the end, I would hope that, yes, by the way, the deworming thing is a very, and clean water, all of these things are very easily seen as a horrendous condition that poor people around the world find themselves. Their children end up with worms, and like you say, it affects their ability to deal in school. We know that without clean water, it just saps the ability of people to live a healthy life and thus have progress in their society. And inoculations, I mean, it goes, unsaid. But in the end, these are services that their government is supposed to provide, and they're not doing it. And most of the time, we're just suggesting, I think Mr. Roberts suggesting, most of the time that's tied to the corruption and despotism of their own government. And until that changes, all we can do is temporarily alleviate some suffering. And whether or not the temporary alleviating of suffering is worth the type of major expenditures that we're talking about, I'm not sure unless it is coupled. Now, by the way, you have made the point that we're talking about specific goals, but the specific goals in eliminating that suffering for now, it's not necessarily eliminating the fundamental cause of the problem, which was outlined by Mr. Roberts. And Dr. McArthur, you've always had good comebacks, so go right ahead.
I don't want to disappoint, but just on the malaria bit, again, happy to follow up with you after that. The ecological factors affecting malaria transmission in Africa are actually different, so it never had the same inroads because it's actually a denser parasite there, in effect. Mm-hmm. So it's actually a unique case, which is why the breakthroughs now are the first time we've ever had it in the scale we've had. In terms of the points on corruption, I would only want to agree on the principle, but differ in the application of its logic. So corruption should be a vetting factor, and I would never advocate supporting dollars going to a disappearance act. That's absolutely the opposite of the point. I think we need to segment the developing countries in a couple of ways. One is the very poor versus the up and coming. I, roughly speaking, would draw the line at about $1,000 per capita income. So India, for example, is in the process of graduating from development assistance, and that's a great success. The countries that are at $200 per capita, $300 per capita income, they can't even afford, if they had every penny in their budget put to these things that you just described, they can't afford that. And so we need to segment as a second criterion the countries that are committed to doing this, like the Malis that were just democratically re-elected, President Touré, terrific leader like President Mutharika, democratically re-elected, great support, and we need to help them implement the programs with all the accountability structures we've described. So if we think about kind of a qualification hurdles of commitment and poverty, then we help support the integrated set of activities that help a country escape extreme poverty through growth, health, infrastructure, education, and so forth. And it's got to be a joint venture strategy. It's not us bringing in all the resources. It's a joint financing strategy, theirs and the international communities. That's where we start to see real results in our experience. I would just flag one final point. If we look at the questions of the deficit and the debt, the absolute values of the dollars we're talking about, I wish they were at the scale that we're affecting those calculations in a real way. We're talking about in an era of 10% of GNP deficits, down to 9% in the latest projections. We're talking about increasing by a few tenths of a point of a percent. Total U.S. assistance to Africa was about $7.5 billion in 2009. 7.5, it's almost rounding error for most budgets. Compare that to any normal aggregate that we read about in the papers these days. The Wall Street bonuses alone in 2009 were $20 billion. So whatever one might think of those bonuses, that reflects how these resources are actually being allocated in any aggregate scale. And so I think we need to understand that there are very small amounts of money. Total global assistance to Africa from all the countries put together works out to about $45 per African. And that's to pay for everything. So I think it's got to be, as you said, goal-based, targeted, outcome-driven, owned by national countries, joint finance, and then that's where we'll see the breakthrough results continue.
Well, you know, $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money. And
I agree.
As to paraphrase our good friend Everett Dirksen, just one thought on the bonuses. I happen to have been author of a piece of legislation that unfortunately didn't get anywhere, said any company that provided bonuses to their senior executives, the executives had to give that back before they could receive any support from the federal government in the form of bailouts. Unfortunately, the people giving these bailouts decided not to put that restriction on. Just as I might add, there are some people who don't want to put caps on the amount of money that is paid to executives who are partners of the United States, but in a charitable institution. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I just want to thank our panel today for illuminating us on these initiatives, the public and private partnerships that we've heard some great success stories, but also some continuing challenges, and I think a variety of different approaches that we all need to be part of this debate. So thanks to all of you. Thanks to those of you who attended, especially the young people here. This is really important for you and your futures as well. So thank you all for being here. We are adjourned.